In the early days of commercial aviation, technology and world events advanced at such a pace that every new design felt like a gamble. Success did not always follow technical merit, nor did failure reliably indicate a flawed design, and timing, or luck, or fate, or whatever you want to call it, was often the deciding factor. Two commercial aircraft built by Curtiss, the Model 53 Condor and the T-32 Condor II, reflect this outlook particularly well. The first Condor began life as a military aircraft, adapted for civil use, at a time when airlines were still feeling their way towards stable operating costs. The second was designed from the outset as a commercial airliner, shaped by the lessons of the previous decade and by a clearer understanding of airline requirements. And yet, the outcomes of these two designs were almost perfectly inverted. The first Condor was the larger and more comfortable of the two. It was broadly competitive with its contemporaries, and in several respects it was ahead of its time. Its failure was not technical, but circumstantial, influenced by world events and economic disaster. The second Condor, by contrast, was smaller and already looked dated on arrival. It achieved commercial success not because it was revolutionary, but because it was inexpensive, and it got lucky in filling a particular commercial niche that existed for a brief period of time. In almost every other respect, it was rapidly outclassed by other aircraft that emerged within a few months of its maiden flight. Aircraft like the Boeing 247, the Douglas DC-1, and to a lesser extent even the Lockheed Electras. And yet, it still found more use. It was operated across numerous countries, it saw use as a commercial airliner, a cargo transport, polar expedition aircraft, and even as a makeshift bomber. The irony is almost impossible to avoid. The aircraft that deserved success on paper failed, whereas the one that should have been a flop succeeded, which is why I've decided to cover the histories of both in this one video today. This video was also chosen because supporters of the channel, either Patreon supporters or YouTube members, decided to give piston engine commercial aircraft a priority in the last round of voting. In the new year, I'm going to be doing a lot more with votes and other perks for both platforms, so if you feel like supporting the channel and having an influence on what we cover first, consider signing up, but no pressure. So, let's start at the beginning. The Curtiss Condors had their origins in an aircraft that was the Curtiss B-2. This design itself was an improvement on the Curtiss XNBS-4, which itself was an improved version of the Martin-designed NBS-1. So, technically, the Condor had its origins in a design that first flew in 1920. Now, doesn't that sound like a recipe for success? Designed in 1926 and entering service in 1929, the B-2 was a weird, seemingly archaic design that perfectly summed up the chaotic state of US Army Air Corps bomber doctrine in the mid-1920s. It did, however, feature one notable improvement on its predecessor. The B-2 was built with an all-metal structure. The fuselage was constructed from welded steel tubing, and the wing spars used a tubular truss structure with ribs of riveted duralumin. The rest of its design was based on principles unchanged since the end of the First World War. It was a large, 3-bay biplane, the majority of its frame was clad in fabric skin, its 5-man crew sat in open stations, it was powered by a pair of liquid-cooled V-12s, and it had a relatively sedate top speed of just 132 miles per hour. The B-2, like a few of its contemporaries of the time, was easily recognized by a distinctive design feature. Because it had an old-school biplane tail arrangement, the rear gunner had a very limited field of fire. The solution had been to install 2 rear gunners, one at the back of each engine nacelle. This technically solved the problem, but it added a lot of extra weight, and it meant that the poor gunners were stuck directly behind a very loud Curtiss Conqueror engine, a power plant which became notorious for oil leaks, coolant leaks, and overheating problems in general. The B-2 was something of a dead end. It was too big, too slow, and too obsolete to be useful. Production numbered just 12 B-2 airframes plus a prototype, and it was withdrawn from Army service in 1934. However, When the B-2 first entered service in 1929, it was followed by a commercial version, the Curtiss Model 53 Condor. Designed in parallel with the B-2, the Condor was often referred to as the Condor 18 because of its 18 passenger seat capacity. This was Curtiss's first attempt at a proper commercial aircraft, not counting a few small single-engine models that had been built for sightseeing tours. 6 Model 53s were built in 2 batches of 3. The first 3 Condors were essentially a hasty civil conversion of the B-2 bomber. They shared the same wings, tail, engines, and landing gear configuration. The only real difference was the fuselage. This was lengthened and modified to accommodate 18 passengers arranged in 6 rows of 3. The crew consisted of 2 pilots and a flight attendant. However, unlike the B-2, the pilots of the Condor enjoyed the benefits of a fully enclosed cabin. Not only did this protect them from the elements, and the risk of inhaling an unfortunate wayward bee, but it was directly connected to the main cabin. This might sound common enough for us, but there were many airliner designs of this period that had the pilots completely segregated from the rest of the crew and the passengers. The next 3 Condors featured further modifications. 5 degrees of dihedral was applied to both wings, length was reduced by 2 feet, the engine nacelles were redesigned and streamlined, as they didn't need to accommodate a rear gunner unless they were feeling particularly violent, and the vertical and horizontal tail surfaces were increased in height and width respectively. Compared to other commercial airliners of the period, the Condors sat on the larger end of the scale. They had a wingspan of 91 feet 8 inches, a loaded weight of 17,900 pounds, and a cruising speed of 125 miles per hour. The only other comparable aircraft built within the United States at this time was the Boeing Model 80, which could also carry 18 passengers. But the Condors had also been designed with passenger comfort as a priority rather than as a passing consideration. The cabin was upholstered rather than being a bare shell, and cushioned seats replaced the comically bare wicker chairs of earlier transports. Passengers had large windows for sightseeing, and 3 inches of soundproofing insulation, known as Dry Zero, was installed throughout the cabin. This made the Condor one of the quietest aircraft to travel in at the time. But its biggest selling points were meant to be its electric passenger lighting and, more importantly, its cabin heating, the first of its kind for any commercial aircraft. This was provided by 2 small boilers that were attached to the engine exhaust manifolds, and they also provided hot water for the built-in lavatory. For a commercial aircraft of the late 1920s, the Curtiss Condor had a lot of creature comforts. Despite having its origins in a brutish, loud, lumbering bomber, it showed real potential for success. Unfortunately, events outside Curtiss's control soon intervened. The Curtiss Condor was just preceded by the arrival of the Fokker and Ford trimotors. These were faster and more advanced monoplanes, but the Condor could still compete as it offered superior levels of comfort and a higher passenger capacity. What it could not do was deal with the financial fallout of the Wall Street crash that had come just 2 months after the first Condor's maiden flight. The market for commercial aircraft dried up. Airliners held on to their existing fleets, and the ones that could afford to invest in new aircraft went with the Ford and Fokker trimotors, as they were both faster and, more importantly, they were cheaper. Though it had been filled with a lot of promise, things now looked incredibly bleak for the Curtiss Condor, and for the Curtiss Aircraft Company in general. As it turned out, Glenn Curtiss would fly for the last time in his life on the 5th Condor in May of 1930. It was a special event, reenacting the famous flight from 1910, when Curtiss piloted his biplane from Albany to New York. That had been the first true long-distance flight in the United States, and Curtiss had finally proven the true viability of the aeroplane. 2 months after reenacting this famous flight, Curtiss would pass away from medical-related complications after appendicitis surgery. Now, as a quick aside, I am aware that I started a video series on the history of Curtiss a while ago and then stopped. Now, there is a reason for that. It is in the process of a major reshoot, well, technically re-record and expansion, and it will be coming out in the new year, so do not worry, I have not forgotten about it. Anyway, moving on. Eventually, the Condors were sold, at a loss, in 1931, to Eastern Air Transport, but their career would be brief. The Curtiss Conqueror engine, which had never really rid itself of its development troubles, was dropped from production in 1932. Without a supply of spare engines, Eastern Air Transport had no choice but to retire the Condors after less than 18 months of service. One aircraft was then sold to a mining company in Nicaragua. One was reportedly scrapped, though sources do conflict, but the other 4 were later purchased by pioneering aviator Clarence D. Chamberlain. One of his many pet projects in the 1930s was the revival of barnstorming tours, but instead of using rickety old biplanes from post-war surplus, he acquired 4 luxury airliners at a bargain price. Of course, they weren't luxury airliners after he'd got his hands on them. They were stripped of all comforts, 27 tiny chairs replaced the 18 plush seats, and the tickets would be sold at dirt cheap prices. Chamberlain used the Condors for sightseeing tours for about 4 years, during which 2 were eventually written off, and he retired the surviving pair in 1939, after which, at some point, they appeared to have been scrapped. The Condor had an inglorious end to a career that never really got started, courtesy of the Great Depression, but its successor would be brought into existence because of the Great Depression. The Curtiss T-32 Condor II, sometimes known as the Curtiss-Wright Condor, owing to the merger of Curtiss and Wright Aeronautical in 1929, was born more out of internal company need rather than external commercial requirements. By the early 1930s, commercial aviation was entering a period of rapid and uneven transition. The Great Depression had severely upset the industry, just as it was beginning to see the emergence of new technology, such as cantilever monoplane wings, insulated cabins, retractable undercarriages, etc. Some companies, such as Douglas and Boeing, were in a better financial position to take advantage of these developments, but Curtiss-Wright was not among them. The company had fallen behind technologically, and it lacked the financial capital to invest in the development of an all-metal monoplane transport. Additionally, its manufacturing capabilities had been hampered by the Great Depression as well. In 1928, Curtiss had acquired Robertson Airlines of St. Louis, Missouri. This acquisition included production facilities, and Curtiss established a manufacturing subsidiary there. This continued after the Curtiss-Wright merger, but in the economic downturn it was closed in 1930. Curtiss-Wright survived the Great Depression, partly due to the merger, and partly due to existing government contracts for military aircraft like the Curtiss Falcon and the Curtiss Hawks. But the company very quickly realized that it needed to get a foothold in the emerging commercial market. Financial woes had deepened isolationist sentiment, and large military contracts could not be relied upon. Thus, as America began to emerge from the Great Depression, or at least the worst bits of it, Curtiss-Wright faced a triple challenge. It had to reopen its closed manufacturing facilities, it had to build a competitive commercial airliner, and it had to do both simultaneously with very little funds. The result was the visual anachronism that is the T-32 Condor II. It was designed by Curtiss-Wright engineer George Page. As early as 1931, he'd begun work on a new twin-engine transport as a hopeful successor to the original Condor. Designated XT-32, the 32 standing for its cargo carrying capacity of 3,200 pounds, his initial proposal was for a modern biplane. One that could outclass the interim monoplane designs like the Ford or Fokker trimotors, and at least feel on par with the faster monoplanes by beating them in comfort and in payload. It inherited much of the construction techniques from the previous Condor. This would simplify production and keep it cheap. For this reason, it was selected as the aircraft to restart production at the St. Louis plant, and George Page was sent there in 1932 to finalize design work and get the prototype built as soon as possible. 1 year later, after a trouble-free construction phase, the prototype T-32 was complete, and it made its maiden flight on January 30th, 1933. Now, considering that the sleek, modern Boeing 247 made its maiden flight just 8 days later, and was then followed by the Douglas DC-1 5 months later in July, you would be forgiven for thinking that the T-32 Condor, with its old-school design, would be dead on arrival. But in commercial aviation of this period, timing was everything, and the new Curtiss Condor got very, very lucky. Not only did it find customers, but it brought in some desperately needed profit for Curtiss-Wright. A few things factored into this. 1. The early Boeing and Douglas monoplanes had long development cycles, necessary due to their highly advanced features. Some airlines urgently needed new aircraft right away, and Curtiss-Wright chose the proven, simpler structure of the Condor to fill that gap quickly. 2. The early Boeing and Douglas monoplanes were, for the time, very, very expensive to develop and initially prototype. The Douglas DC-1 alone cost $320,000 to design and build. Now today that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but that development cost absorbed almost 3 years of Douglas's company profits. Curtiss-Wright, struggling during the Great Depression, avoided this massive financial gamble by relying on a technically conservative airframe. And 3, though it looked like an outdated machine, and was built with the old-school methods of having a basic tubular frame that was covered in fabric, George Page had gone to incredible lengths to make the Condor as modern, comfortable, and practical as possible, and to his credit, he succeeded. It featured a state-of-the-art electric retractable landing gear. It was powered by a pair of 650 horsepower Wright Cyclone engines, and it was made as aerodynamic as possible for a biplane. The fuselage was refined through extensive wind tunnel testing, and a streamlined vertical stabilizer and rudder replaced the biplane tail design of its predecessors. All control surfaces were mounted on ball bearings and fitted with aerodynamic and servo compensation, which would give the aircraft light and precise handling for its size. It was also designed for ease of maintenance and quick service turnarounds. The fabric coverings incorporated 125 zippered inspection panels, allowing rapid access to all the areas that required routine inspections. The engines could be fully serviced from ground level by crews, and the service equipment was conveniently stored in the rear of the engine nacelle behind access panels. Now, speed, of course, was never going to be the Condor's selling point, so George Page turned the Condor's bulk to its advantage. The aircraft featured a particularly spacious cabin. This could accommodate up to 15 passengers in a level of comfort that was not yet experienced in commercial air travel. The cabin was lined with soundproofing, it had comfortable leather seats, plenty of legroom, large windows, electric lights, a lavatory, bar service, and each passenger had their own hot and cold air vents. Supposedly, the noise level in flight was no louder than that of a railway carriage. But the defining feature of this new Condor was that Curtiss-Wright had built it with the world's first complete sleeper cabins. The interior could be configured to accommodate 12 passengers with seating that converted into sleeping berths. This is how they sold their old-school-looking aircraft to the airlines. Commercial transport in the late 20s, early 30s could not make long-distance coast-to-coast journeys in one flight. Early transcontinental services involved flying a leg of the journey during the day, and then either staying at a hotel or boarding a train for night travel. Both options allowed passengers to get some sleep, but it made these routes inconvenient and expensive. Owing to increased passenger demand, flying overnight was increasingly becoming unavoidable. Yet the aircraft then entering service, particularly the new generations of compact high-speed monoplanes, were ill-suited for this service. They were fast but loud, offered little opportunity for rest, and none at all for sleeping berths. But passengers that were accustomed to Pullman sleepers on overnight trains were still expecting some degree of physical comfort when traveling through the night on aircraft. Airlines thus faced a problem, a very specific problem. Current commercial aircraft were too uncomfortable to perform the night services required of them, but the more advanced aircraft with longer range were still in early development. Nobody knew when exactly they would be available in sufficient numbers. And this was the gap that Curtiss-Wright exploited beautifully. By offering the Condor with sleeping berths, they allowed airlines to offer a continuous overnight air service without forcing passengers into hotels or competing rail lines at intermediate stops. Thus, the Condor's value lay not in its performance or in cutting-edge technological developments, but in arriving at precisely the moment when comfort, rather than speed, briefly became the deciding factor. As a result, Eastern Air Transport and American Airlines both placed orders for the Condor II before the prototype had even completed testing. The first production Condor was delivered to American Airlines on April 17, 1933, and both companies had the type fully in service by the summer. Its simple design meant that Curtiss was able to produce them remarkably quickly. By 1934, Curtiss had sold 18 Condors to those two airlines for a significant profit, despite the fact that the Condor was the cheapest airline of its class on the market, with an initial price tag of just $60,000. In commercial service, the type was equally popular with passengers as it was with aircrews. The Condor was comfortable to travel in and easy to fly. American Airlines in particular were quick to advertise their new planes, guaranteeing the utmost in travel comfort and placing no extra charge on sleeper service. Pilots found it a delight to operate. The cockpits were large and roomy, there was space to move around, and the controls were light, responsive, and familiar. Against the odds, the Condor had become a commercial success, but its dominance on these overnight passenger routes was to be very short-lived. By January 1934, just 6 months after receiving their first Condor, American Airlines received their first Douglas DC-2. More soon followed, and very soon the DC-2 was in service on all of the airline's major routes. The Condor was relegated to night service only, but even this wasn't enough to keep it relevant for particularly long. By late 1935, it was obvious that the type was lagging behind, and with the arrival of the even more popular Douglas DC-3 in 1936, which did also come with sleeping berths, its time with American Airlines was more or less done. Eastern Air Transport retired its Condors even quicker. Most of its major routes were too short to properly require sleeping cabins, so the Condor lost relevance even more quickly. Instead, the airline pursued speed over comfort, and converted its entire fleet over to DC-2s, and the Lockheed Model 14 Super Electra, an aircraft which, incidentally, will be getting its video very, very, very soon. By the end of that year, both companies had sold all their airworthy Condors abroad, and by early 1937, not a single commercial aircraft of this type remained in the United States. But this was not the end of the Condor's career, not by a long shot. Including the 18 aircraft that saw their brief moment of commercial success, Curtiss-Wright eventually produced 45 Condors. Some were commercial models, a few were military, and many were built or converted to an upgraded standard, which became known as the AT-32. This model featured NACA-style cowlings on the engines, and the nacelles were extended for better streamlining. But the most important change was the upgrade to 710 horsepower Wright Cyclone engines and the shift to 3-blade variable pitch propellers. This gave the Condors a much-needed performance boost, and although its days as a commercial transport in the US were done, it found a variety of other uses. 2 Condors were supplied to the US Army Air Corps as the YC-30, which were used as executive transports for a number of years. 2 others were supplied to the US Navy as the R-4C-1. These were actually among the last Condors to be built, and they were used by both the Navy and Marine Corps as executive transports as well. They served for a number of years before then being transferred to the US Antarctic Service Expedition in 1939. They would be used for transporting and long-distance surveying over the Antarctic, but owing to the degrading geopolitical situation, the expedition was curtailed, and these aircraft were actually abandoned on the ice. But speaking of the Antarctic, another Condor had already flown there as far back as 1933. A specially modified Curtiss Condor, with interchangeable floats, skis, and fixed gear, was flown by naval air officer, pilot, explorer, and general cold place enthusiast Richard Byrd. He chose the Condor not only for its high load capacity and simple, robust construction, but also, curiously, for its fabric coverings, which proved easier to repair in remote, hostile environments, such as Antarctica. Byrd's second polar expedition was a failure, for reasons that are too complex for the scope of this video, but suffice to say, you don't want your expedition leader almost dying from carbon monoxide poisoning whilst stuck in a weather monitoring station on the ice sheet, completely by himself without any sort of medical assistance. Spoiler alert, he does survive thanks to a brave and daring rescue mission. But the Condor had behaved perfectly, logging thousands of miles of flight time in freezing Antarctic conditions. Not only was the Condor's simple airframe rugged and dependable, but it was proving easy to adapt to a number of tasks, which is why Curtiss-Wright then advertised it for export, not just as a civil aircraft, but as a military one as well. 3 were built as the CT-32, a cargo-carrying variant with a large loading door on the starboard side, and these were all sold to the Argentine Navy. They could carry up to 24 fully equipped soldiers, or 10 wounded soldiers on stretchers, or almost 2 tons of cargo. 8 more would be built as the slightly more ambitious BT-32, which was a bombing variant of the Condor. These could carry up to 1,700 pounds of light bombs, and came with manually operated machine gun turrets on the top of the nose and on the central fuselage, though it seems that not all were operated in this particular configuration. The prototype was exported to China for evaluation, though no orders for military versions followed. 3 seaplane variants were sold to the Colombian Air Force, and honestly, in their light grey paint scheme, they didn't look half bad, and 4 land plane versions were originally ordered by the Bolivian government, who wanted to use them against Paraguay in the Chaco War. But for a multiplicity of complex reasons, they never reached the Bolivians. Instead, all 4 ended up in civil service with Peru as cargo transports. It's actually quite an interesting story, and one that I will delve into with a couple of videos that I'm planning on the Chaco War, which is a criminally neglected topic, as it was the first modern air war in Latin America, and because it ran from 1932 to 1935, it featured all sorts of weird and wonderful interwar aircraft that otherwise had fairly mundane service lives. Anyway, back to the Condor. After it was retired from commercial service in the US, existing airframes were sold on to foreign airlines or governments, and Curtiss-Wright produced a handful more directly for overseas buyers. Sources do, unfortunately, conflict a lot here, so take this bit of information with a pinch of salt. 4 aircraft supposedly went to the British firm International Air Freight in the mid to late 30s. The company's management then neglected them, apparently not appreciating their utility. They were then impressed by the RAF, but then never used, held in storage, and then scrapped to make room for other aircraft in early or mid-1939. 5 or 6 Condors were supposedly going to be sold to Mexico, but then the US government learned that the Mexicans planned to donate them for use in the Spanish Civil War, and politely told them no. Paradoxically, these aircraft would finally return to the US, only to be converted to military transports and given to the Chinese for use in the Second Sino-Japanese War. But perhaps the most famous of the export Condors was a commercial model that was sold to Switzerland. Swissair purchased a single Condor, the only AT-32C, which was made specially for them, and it was configured for 15 passengers. Entering service in 1934, its cabin became the regular workplace for a young woman named Nellie Hedwig Diener. Emulating emerging trends in the United States, Swissair hired Nellie as Europe's first female flight attendant. They could not have picked a better candidate. Not only was she kind, cheerful, engaging, and uncommonly pretty, but she was truly passionate about flying. Indeed, she only took the job because flying lessons were too expensive and nobody would hire a female commercial pilot anyway. So this was the next best thing. Very quickly, she became the darling of the airline. In a time when lunch service wasn't really a thing yet, Nellie would personally prepare sandwiches and thermoses of tea and coffee for her passengers each morning before a flight. Eventually, she would even learn her passengers' favourite brands of wine, cognac, or even cigars, and bring these comforts aboard as well. Nellie was dedicated to her work. The passengers loved her, and she was converting any lingering skeptics at Swissair to the importance of her role. She understood that flying was still a very scary undertaking for many passengers, and she did her best to make the 3-hour 40-minute flight from Dubendorf to Berlin a pleasant experience. She played cards with her passengers, read aloud to them, and would often sing. The cabin was insulated well enough for people to hear her. Newsreels and interviews soon made her famous across Europe, and by extension the Curtiss Condor that was often her floating home. Beautiful, witty, and charming, Nellie Diener soon became known as Engel de Luft, the Angel of the Air. It is, therefore, especially tragic that the only airframe failure of a commercial Condor would claim her life. On the 27th of July 1934, the aircraft encountered a thunderstorm over southern Germany. In the severe turbulence, the right wing structure failed and mostly detached from the aircraft, which, out of control, plunged into a forest outside Tuttlingen. Investigations later determined that the cause was a combination of a previously undetected stress fracture and poor quality welding from the factory. All those aboard, 9 passengers and 3 crew, perished. It had been Nellie Diener's 79th flight, and she died aged just 22. If you can find a copy, there is a great book that details the fascinating but brief life of Europe's first stewardess, written by Pascal Mader. It's only in German, but if this is the type of more biographical history that interests you, I heartily recommend it as it is a fantastic read. Tragic as it was, the crash of Swissair's Condor was the only major loss the type would experience as a direct result of design flaws or defects, which, for an interwar design, isn't bad at all. Now, 2 other Condors were lost in fatal commercial accidents, but those were attributed to pilot error and not a defect in the airframe itself. On the whole, the type proved to be remarkably sturdy and easy to maintain, and as a result, several Condors enjoyed remarkably long service lives. One ex-American Airlines Condor was operated on remote bush flights in Alaska from 1937 to 1944, after which it was then sold on to Mexico and continued flying until 1950. Another Condor, one of the last built, eventually found its way into Peruvian civil service until 1941. It was then requisitioned by the Peruvian Air Force and served as a transport for many years, not being retired until 1956, which is not bad at all for a design that could trace its DNA all the way back to an old-school bomber from 1920. Unfortunately, no examples of either Condor survives today. However, I have recently discovered that an organization in the States is planning to build a new Condor II from scratch, so maybe we'll be able to see this interesting machine again in the future. Time will tell. Today, the Condors are mostly forgotten, with the exception that the latter model has some niche popularity in the aircraft modeling community. Though they were overshadowed by events or rival designs, they still had a rich and surprisingly varied history. Now, people often ask why I cover these sort of aircraft and not focus solely on the big success stories, or the famous World War II warbirds, or the Cold War jets. I've been producing these videos for 4 years now, and I've not done a single one yet on, say, the Hawker Hurricane, the Supermarine Spitfire, or things like the MiG-15 or F-86 Sabre. This is for a few reasons. One, when I began this channel, I wanted to focus on the aircraft that have been neglected by the history books, as they're the ones that have held my interest since I was very young. 2, I feel that a lot of famous aircraft have been covered to death, and if I were to make a video on them, it would have to be a video worth watching. And 3, making a video that is worth watching on said topics is a monumental amount of research and writing. But those videos are coming. Some are now well advanced in planning, and I'm very excited to say that you'll be seeing some deep dives on the histories of some more famous World War I, World War II, and Cold War aircraft in the coming year. I will, of course, continue to cover the obscure, the weird, and the wonderful. As always, thank you all so much for watching. And a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members who help keep this channel going. A big shout out, of course, to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members, and a warm welcome to Deso Callahan 5677, who is the newest member of this special group. Now, because I am taking time off over Christmas, this will be a pre-recorded end screen, so if I do miss any new members on the screen here, please don't panic, I will update everything in January with the new upload. Hopefully, if my plan has worked out, this will be one of many videos I have uploaded in the last 2 weeks of December, as part of a sort of present for all you wonderful people, newly joined or regulars, who have supported my glorified lectures over the last 4 years. But that is all for today. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.